dying end of 1943, the leaders of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union had met in Tehran, there to speak for their peoples, collectively to plan, collectively to devise the great three-front offensive of 1944. As the year began, in the Far East, while the British and Chinese fought in Burma, American power struck in the Pacific. This was Kwajalein. Up in the Marshalls. This was Eniwetok. Westward, ever westward, this was Palau. Up from the south as well. This was Biak. Into the very strongholds, into pre-war Japanese territory, Saipan. Into the old American bastions that Japan had taken, Guam. The price was paid in dead, in blood, in terror. This man is blinded. We who are alive and have our eyes, a year from now, we must tell him what we have done with the world for which he lost his eyes. (1944). In February and March, the Red Army broke the German lines in the Ukraine and swept forward 300 miles to the Romanian borders. Here are the Germans who will never fight again. Spring 1944. In their great British bases, the Western armies were massing the guns, the shells, the tanks, the trucks, the planes, the food stocks, the gasoline, spare parts, field equipment, mine detectors, medical supplies, and troops. And the troops, British, Americans, Canadians, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Dutchmen, Poles, Norwegians, Czechs, and Danes. Troops of the United Nations. Troops who are the stuff of any invasion, troops who on their unassuming shoulders carry the whole world's hopes for liberty. At Supreme Headquarters, General Eisenhower gave the word on Monday, June 5th. The vast fleet taut for battle puts out into the darkening sea. Men move now with exaggerated caution. They are going into attack. They are going into the seawalls, the barricades, the trenches, the guns, the vast emplacements that Rommel had called impregnable. They are going into the crossfire and mine beaches between Caen and Barfleur on the northern coast of France. It is barely dawn. The troops have not yet landed on the beaches. This is the landing. This is it. We are going in. And with this stroke, the people of Europe so long mute will speak. On the beaches now, the first barricades are down, the first fires are dying. The first thrust in the great battle of the West has been driven home.
Nobody escaped Berlin in April 1945. Not the soldiers, not the civilians, and not the man hiding 50 feet underground who had started all of it. This is the story of the last 11 days inside the Führerbunker, and what really happened in those final hours before the most powerful empire in Europe collapsed into rubble. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was basically over. Everyone knew it. The Americans were pushing in from the west. The British were closing in from the north. And from the east, the direction that would decide everything, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were marching toward Berlin with one goal in mind. But underground, beneath the Reich Chancellery in the heart of Berlin, a small group of people were still pretending the war could be won. Adolf Hitler was living in a concrete bunker, cut off from reality, surrounded by yes-men, planning counterattacks with armies that no longer existed. And for 11 days, the world above him burned while he waited. This is the story of how it all ended. To understand what was happening inside that bunker, you first need to understand what Berlin looked like from the outside in April 1945. The city was already destroyed. Since 1943, the Allied bombing campaigns had been hitting Berlin almost every night. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings that had stood for 100 years were gone. Streets that used to be full of cafes and shops were now just stretches of broken concrete and twisted metal. By April 1945, roughly 2.5 million civilians were still living in Berlin. Many of them had nowhere to go. The roads out of the city were dangerous, the trains weren't running properly, and a lot of people genuinely believed or told themselves that things couldn't get any worse. They were wrong. On April 16, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the final Soviet offensive toward Berlin. The operation was called the Berlin Strategic Offensive, and it involved over 2 million soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks, and around 42,000 artillery guns. The ground shook from 100 miles away when the guns started firing. The German army that was supposed to stop them. It was a shell of what it used to be. The soldiers defending Berlin were mostly teenagers, boys from the Hitler Youth who had never seen real combat, and old men who had been pulled out of retirement. Some of them were given a single anti-tank weapon, maybe 1 or 2 days of training, and told to stop the most powerful land army on the planet. It was not a fair fight. The Soviet forces broke through the German defensive lines in days. Within a week, they were on the outskirts of Berlin, and within 2 weeks they had completely surrounded the city, cutting off every road, every rail line, every escape route. Berlin was a trap, and everyone inside it knew it. Now let's go underground. The Führerbunker was not some grand underground palace. People sometimes imagine it that way, like Hitler was living in luxury while the city burned above him. But the reality was much smaller and much more claustrophobic than that. The bunker was built in 2 sections beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden. The upper level, sometimes called the Führerbunker, had rooms for staff, a kitchen, and a few basic facilities. The lower level, which is what most people refer to when they say the Führerbunker, was where Hitler actually lived. It was about 30 feet underground, reinforced with thick concrete walls, and it had roughly 18 small rooms. The ceilings were low, the air was damp. The ventilation system ran constantly, making a background hum that never stopped. The rooms were tiny. Hitler's private quarters consisted of a bedroom, a study, and a small bathroom. That was it. And in those tiny rooms, some of the most consequential meetings of the Second World War took place. By April 1945, the people living and working in the bunker had formed a strange, surreal little community. There was Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime partner, who had actually traveled to Berlin against Hitler's wishes to be with him in the final days. There was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, who moved his entire family, including his 6 children, into the bunker. There was Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, who controlled access to the Führer and made sure to keep himself indispensable. There were military advisors, secretaries, doctors, and guards, all crammed into this underground concrete maze while the city above them was being torn apart. Witnesses who survived later described the atmosphere in the bunker as deeply strange. On one hand, there was a real sense of doom. Everyone could hear the artillery. As the Soviet forces got closer, the explosions got louder, and by the final days, the ground itself would shake regularly. The electricity flickered, dust fell from the ceiling, water sometimes leaked through the walls. But on the other hand, and this is the part that's hard to wrap your head around, some people were still holding cocktail parties. Eva Braun, according to multiple accounts, was actually in relatively good spirits for much of the time. She organized small social gatherings in the evenings. People drank champagne. There was music. Couples danced. It was like 2 realities existing at the same time. Outside, total collapse. Inside, a strange kind of forced normalcy. And then there was Hitler himself. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler was a physically broken man. People who saw him in those final weeks described someone who looked decades older than his 56 years. He walked with a shuffle. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, a symptom that had been getting worse for years, likely related to Parkinson's disease or some other neurological condition. His face was pale and puffy. His posture, which had always been so rigid and controlled in his public appearances, was now bent and slouched. He relied heavily on his personal doctor, Theodore Morell, who had been injecting him with a cocktail of drugs for years: stimulants, sedatives, vitamins, and other substances, some of which we now know were genuinely harmful. When Morell finally left the bunker in the last days, Hitler was left without his daily injections, which likely made his physical decline even worse. But physically broken didn't mean mentally calm. Hitler's behavior in the bunker swung between 2 extremes. There were periods of cold, eerie calm, where he sat quietly, talked about the future in vague terms, or discussed completely irrelevant things like architecture and his plans for rebuilding German cities after the war. Cities that were, at that very moment, being leveled. And then there were the rages. Hitler's military briefings in the bunker became infamous. Every day, he would meet with his military staff to discuss the situation on the front. And every day, the news was worse. But instead of adjusting to reality, Hitler kept demanding counterattacks. He kept referencing army units that had already been destroyed or scattered. He would point to maps and order divisions to move to positions, not accounting for, or not caring, that those divisions no longer had the men or the equipment to do anything. When his generals tried to tell him the truth, he would explode. One of the most famous of these moments came on April 22nd. During a briefing, Hitler was told that a major counterattack he had ordered, carried out by the SS Panzer Corps under Felix Steiner, had simply not happened. Steiner didn't have enough men. The attack was impossible. His generals had known this for days, but nobody had wanted to be the one to tell the Führer. When they finally did, Hitler had what multiple witnesses described as a complete breakdown. He screamed, he paced, he accused his generals of being cowards and traitors. He ranted about betrayal, about how everyone around him had failed him, how the German people had failed him, how the army had failed him. He said the war was lost. For a few moments, the mask came completely off. And then quietly he said he would stay in Berlin. He would not run. He would die in the city. After that day, something shifted inside the bunker. That admission, that Hitler himself believed it was over, changed the atmosphere. People who had been holding onto hope started making plans to leave. Some did leave. Others stayed, bound by loyalty or fear or a complete inability to imagine a world without the regime they had served. While all of this was happening underground, Berlin was experiencing something that has very few parallels in modern history. The Soviet advance into the city itself began on April 23rd, and what followed was brutal. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army fought its way into the city. The German defenders, those teenagers and old men, fought back in some cases with real desperation. Because they had been told, and many genuinely believed, that capture by the Soviets meant death, or worse. That fear was not entirely without basis. The Soviet soldiers who marched into Germany in 1945 were men who had spent years fighting through some of the most savage warfare in human history, who had liberated concentration camps, who had seen their own country devastated by the German invasion of 1941. The revenge they took on parts of the German civilian population, particularly the widespread sexual violence, is one of the darkest chapters of the war's final months, and one that historians have only relatively recently started to fully document. Berlin's civilians were caught in the middle of all of this. Many hid in basements and cellars. Some tried to surrender to whoever reached them first. Others simply waited. The city's infrastructure had completely collapsed. No running water, no electricity, no food distribution. People were surviving on whatever they had stored. Above ground, the fighting was close and personal and devastating. Entire city blocks changed hands multiple times. Snipers were everywhere. Artillery shells fell constantly. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, became the site of some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle, as Soviet forces pushed to capture it and raise their flag. The iconic photograph of Soviet soldiers raising the red flag over the Reichstag was taken on April 30th, 1945. That date matters. We'll come back to it. Meanwhile, from the West, American and British forces had essentially stopped advancing toward Berlin. There had been a decision, controversial then and now, that Berlin would be left to the Soviets. The Western Allies would not race to capture the German capital. Eisenhower had made the call, partly to avoid any accidental conflict with Soviet forces, and partly because Berlin itself was not seen as the main military priority. So the soldiers fighting their way through those Berlin streets, block by block, were almost entirely Soviet, and they were motivated by something very personal. One of the most interesting things that happened in those final days was watching the Nazi leadership fracture. For 12 years, men like Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler had positioned themselves as completely loyal to Hitler. They had built their entire identities, their entire careers, their entire sense of self around their connection to the Führer. And in the last week of April 1945, both of them tried to negotiate with the enemy behind his back. Goering, who had fled to Bavaria, sent a message to the bunker on April 23rd suggesting that since Hitler was trapped in Berlin, maybe Goering should step up and take over as leader of Germany. He framed it carefully, but the message was clear enough. Hitler, when he received it, was furious. He had Goering arrested and stripped of all his titles. Himmler was even more brazen. The head of the SS, the man who had overseen the Holocaust, who had run the concentration camps, who had built the most feared police apparatus in German history, was secretly meeting with a Swedish diplomat named Count Bernadotte, trying to arrange a surrender deal with the Western Allies. He thought the Allies might prefer to accept a German surrender through him rather than through the Soviets. When news of Himmler's betrayal reached Hitler on April 28th, through a BBC radio broadcast, of all things, the reaction in the bunker was explosive. Hitler called Himmler the greatest traitor in German history. He had Himmler's personal representative in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, arrested. Fegelein had also been caught trying to escape the bunker in civilian clothes with forged papers and a significant amount of cash and valuables. After a brief and essentially pointless military tribunal in the bunker, he was taken outside and shot. The circle was closing. The people Hitler had trusted most, The men who had built this entire empire with him were running, negotiating, saving themselves. And Hitler was still underground, still talking about counterattacks, still looking at maps. On the night of April 28th, moving into the early hours of April 29th, 1945, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. The ceremony happened in the map room of the bunker just after midnight. It lasted about 10 minutes. Eva Braun had been Hitler's companion for many years, but their relationship had always been kept secret from the German public. Hitler had carefully cultivated an image of himself as a man married to Germany, someone who had sacrificed personal happiness for the nation. Eva had lived in the shadows, largely unknown to ordinary Germans, sometimes going months without seeing him. But she had come to Berlin to be with him at the end. Against his wishes, she had refused to leave, and in the last hours he gave her the only thing she had apparently always wanted, his name. A local civil official, Walter Wagner, was brought in to perform the ceremony. Both Hitler and Eva had to declare that they were of pure Aryan blood and that they had no hereditary diseases. The standard Nazi marriage formalities, which in this context, 50 feet underground while the city above burned, had an almost absurd quality to them. Eva Braun became Eva Hitler. Witnesses at the ceremony included Goebbels and Bormann. Afterward, there was a small gathering in Hitler's study, more of a wake than a celebration, by most accounts. Hitler's secretaries were invited in. Champagne was served. People sat quietly. Hitler talked about the old days, about Munich, about the early years of the movement. It was, by all accounts, a deeply strange and melancholy evening. At some point during that night, Hitler also dictated his personal will and his political testament. In his political testament, he blamed the Jews for the war, consistent to the end with the ideology that had defined his entire life and caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. He named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as President of Germany and Goebbels as the new Reich Chancellor. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party. And then he went to bed. April 29th was a day of waiting. Hitler had made his decision. He had decided to die in Berlin. What he was waiting for, apparently, was news of whether any of the counterattack forces were actually going to reach the city and relieve it. They weren't. The army units he kept referencing, Wenck's army to the south, forces to the north, were either destroyed, scattered, or simply not going to make it. The generals knew this. Some tried to communicate it. Hitler either didn't believe them or had moved past the point where it mattered. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were getting closer to the Reich Chancellery with every passing hour. The bunker's garrison, the soldiers tasked with defending it, could hear small arms fire in the streets nearby. The situation was not going to last much longer. On April 29th, Hitler also received news that Mussolini, his old ally, the Italian dictator who had formed the original Axis with him, had been captured by Italian partisans and executed. His body had been hung upside down at a gas station in Milan for people to see. This reportedly had an effect on Hitler. He had already been determined not to be captured, but this news reinforced it. He was absolutely not going to allow himself or Eva to be taken alive and put on display. He made arrangements. Cyanide capsules were procured. Hitler had actually been suspicious of the capsules provided by the SS, worried, after Himmler's betrayal, that they might be fake, so he had one tested on his dog Blondie, a German shepherd he had kept throughout the war. Blondie died. Hitler was reportedly deeply upset by this. He had always had a particular affection for dogs, but it confirmed the capsules worked. He also got his pistol ready. April 30th, 1945. Hitler woke up and was informed that the Soviet forces were now within a block or two of the Reich Chancellery. Some reports suggest the fighting had already reached the Chancellery garden directly above the bunker. In the early afternoon, Hitler had a last lunch with his 2 secretaries and his cook. Eva was not present. She had reportedly already said her goodbyes the day before. After lunch, Hitler came out to say farewell to the remaining staff in the bunker. He walked slowly down the line, shaking hands with each person. Most people who witnessed this moment later described it as dreamlike. Here was the man who had dominated Germany for 12 years, the man whose voice had filled stadiums, whose decisions had reshaped a continent, shuffling through this tiny underground corridor, shaking hands, mumbling a few words, moving on. And then he and Eva went into his private quarters and closed the door. What happened next has been reconstructed from witness testimony, forensic evidence, and documents. The basic outline is clear, even if some details have been debated for decades. Eva took her cyanide capsule. Hitler shot himself in the head with his pistol and also took cyanide, though which one actually killed him has been debated. The consensus among historians is that the gunshot was the cause of death, with the cyanide as a backup. According to Hitler's explicit instructions, their bodies were to be burned. He did not want what happened to Mussolini to happen to him. The time was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon. Shortly after, aides entered the room. They wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them up through the bunker to the Reich Chancellery garden above, placed them in a shallow trench, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. The Soviet artillery was still landing nearby. The people who stood in that garden to briefly pay their respects, Goebbels, Bormann, and a small number of others, did so while shells were falling around them. The bodies burned for several hours. The people in the bunker didn't all survive the next few days. Goebbels, true to the end to his belief in National Socialism, refused to flee or surrender. On May 1st, the day after Hitler's death, he and his wife Magda made the decision that has haunted history ever since. They poisoned their 6 children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hold, Hedda, and Hyde, ranging in age from 4 to 12 years old, with cyanide. Then they went outside and both of them died as well. Whether they were shot by an SS guard at their request or took cyanide or both has been debated, but the result was the same. An entire family gone, because a man could not imagine a world without the regime to which he had given everything. Martin Bormann attempted to escape from the bunker on the night of May 1st with a group of others. What exactly happened to him was a mystery for decades, fueling all kinds of conspiracy theories. His fate was finally established with more certainty when his skeletal remains were found during construction work in Berlin in 1972, and later confirmed through DNA analysis in 1998. He had almost certainly died on the night he attempted to escape, possibly from cyanide. Others made it out. Some of Hitler's secretaries survived. Various military personnel scattered in different directions. A few were captured. Some managed to disappear into the general chaos of post-war Germany, at least for a while. The German forces defending Berlin held on for a few more days after Hitler's death, but the end was inevitable, and everyone knew it. On May 2, 1945, the German commander in Berlin, General Helmuth Weidling, surrendered the city to the Soviet forces. After days of brutal street fighting that had cost both sides enormous casualties, the guns in Berlin largely went quiet. The Battle of Berlin, which had lasted from April 16 to May 2, resulted in approximately 100,000 Soviet soldiers killed, along with an estimated 100,000 German military dead, and tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Some estimates put total deaths much higher. The numbers are still debated by historians today because the chaos was so complete that accurate records simply don't exist for much of what happened. The physical city was barely recognizable. The center of Berlin looked like the surface of the moon, craters, rubble, skeletal buildings with no roofs or walls, abandoned vehicles, debris everywhere. The smell, by multiple accounts, was overwhelming: fires, broken sewage lines, and the bodies that hadn't yet been recovered. But it was over. 6 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war in Europe was finished. The discovery of Hitler's fate by the Soviets was complicated, and it matters because it fed decades of conspiracy theories. Soviet forces found burned remains in the Reich Chancellery Garden. They conducted their own investigation, and largely for political reasons, because Stalin was apparently reluctant to admit that Hitler was definitely dead, kept their findings ambiguous for years. This ambiguity was the seed for every Hitler escape to Argentina theory that followed. The actual forensic picture, as it has been pieced together over decades, is fairly clear. Dental records were used to identify both Hitler and Eva Braun from fragments found in the garden. The Soviets had kept skull fragments and other remains, some of which were later examined by historians and forensic specialists. In 2018, French researchers conducted DNA analysis on a tooth fragment held in Russian archives and confirmed that it was consistent with Hitler's dental records from the war. The analysis supported the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30, 1945. He did not escape to Argentina. He did not live out his days under a fake name somewhere. He died in a concrete room 50 feet underground, in the ruins of the city and the regime he had built. But the myth has persisted, and the reason it has persisted is interesting in itself. There is something deeply uncomfortable about the straightforward reality that one of the most destructive forces in human history just died, quietly, in a small room, without justice, without a trial, without having to face what he had done. No Nuremberg for Hitler, no moment of reckoning, just a gunshot, a fire, and then chaos. That's part of why the bunker story has never stopped being told, because the ending feels wrong. It feels too small for the scale of what came before it. The bunker itself no longer exists in any accessible form. After the war, the site was in the Soviet sector of divided Berlin. The Soviets partially demolished the bunker in the late 1940s. Further demolition work was done in the 1980s by East German authorities, who were apparently concerned about it becoming a site of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. Today, a parking lot and some apartment buildings sit roughly where the bunker was located. There is a small, easy-to-miss informational plaque near the site, put up in 2006, with a diagram showing roughly where the bunker was and a brief explanation of its history. No monument, no museum, just a sign. Germany has had a complicated relationship with how to memorialize, or whether to memorialize, the physical sites associated with the Nazi regime. And in the case of the bunker, the decision was essentially made to erase it rather than preserve it. You can walk over the ground where it stood today without knowing it. A lot of people do. Here's what I think is the most striking thing about the story of the Führerbunker. Hitler spent those last 11 days in a state of complete denial, but it wasn't a passive denial. He wasn't just sitting in a corner, refusing to think about what was happening. He was actively, energetically insisting on a version of reality that had no connection to the actual world. He ordered attacks by armies that didn't exist. He talked about the future of cities that were being destroyed in real time. He blamed everyone around him for failures that were the direct result of decisions he himself had made. He never, not once, in any of the documented accounts from the bunker, expressed genuine responsibility for what the war had cost. The man who had started it all, who had made the decision to invade country after country, who had personally overseen the ideology and infrastructure that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. That man spent his last days convinced he was the victim of betrayal. That is not a redemption story. That is not a villain who found some kind of humanity at the end. What the bunker shows us is something more disturbing, a person who, right up until the final moment, never truly reckoned with what he had done. And the people around him, some of them, chose to die rather than face a world without the structure he had provided. Goebbels and his wife killed their children rather than let them grow up in a Germany that wasn't National Socialist. Think about that. They murdered 6 kids rather than take a chance on a future. That's what ideology can do to people. That's what it looks like when belief in a system becomes so total that you can't imagine existing outside of it. The bunker isn't interesting because it's dramatic, although it is. It's interesting because it's a kind of moral conclusion. Everything that the Third Reich had built, the propaganda, the racial laws, the wars, the camps, it all ended in this tiny concrete box where a sick old man shot himself, and his wife of one day took poison, and their aides burned the bodies in the garden while shells fell nearby. That's the ending. That's what it came to. It's worth spending a moment on the Soviet soldiers who fought to take Berlin, because they often get reduced to a background detail in Western tellings of this story. The Eastern Front was the largest and most deadly theater of the entire Second World War. The Soviet Union lost somewhere between 27 and 30 million people during the conflict, a number so large it's almost impossible to fully absorb. For context, the United States lost around 400,000. The UK lost around 450,000. The Soviet losses were in a completely different category. The men who fought their way into Berlin in April 1945 had lived through that. Many of them had been fighting since 1941. They had watched their country be invaded, their cities destroyed, their families killed. They had fought the siege of Leningrad, which lasted 900 days. They had fought at Stalingrad, one of the most brutal battles in history. They had pushed the German army back across thousands of miles of territory. When they finally raised their flag over the Reichstag on April 30th, the same day Hitler died 50 feet underground, it wasn't just a military victory. It was the end of something that had cost them almost everything. Marshal Zhukov, who commanded the operation, later described the battle for Berlin as among the hardest fighting of the entire war, even compared to Stalingrad. The Germans, even in defeat, even with teenagers and old men, fought back in many places with real desperation. The Soviet victory in Berlin came at an enormous cost, but it came. So let's pull all of this together. In April 1945, Adolf Hitler retreated to a concrete bunker beneath Berlin as the city he had made the capital of his empire was being torn apart around him. He spent his last 11 days in a state of increasing disconnection from reality, ordering non-existent armies, raging at generals who were trying to tell him the truth, clinging to the idea that something would change. Nothing changed. The Soviet forces closed in from every direction. The German defenses collapsed. The city burned. On April 29th, with Soviet soldiers within a block of his position, Hitler married Eva Braun in a 10-minute ceremony in the bunker's map room. The next day, the two of them went into his private quarters and died, she by poison, he by a gunshot to the head. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. 6 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years lasted 12. It started with a rally and ended in a parking lot. The Führerbunker story is, in a lot of ways, the story of what happens at the end of unchecked power. Not a dramatic last stand. Not a moment of recognition or regret. Just the slow, ugly collapse of a delusion, with a lot of people getting killed in the process. The scale of what the Nazi regime did, the Holocaust, the wars of aggression, the civilian deaths across Europe, has to be the frame through which we understand those final 11 days. Hitler didn't suffer a tragic end. He received, in some ways, the most merciful end he could have had, dying by his own hand on his own terms, before he could be made to answer for any of it. History rarely gives us the endings we think people deserve, but it does give us the truth, eventually, if we're willing to look at it clearly. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.